Hey, you guys, welcome back to Theology Today podcast with Luis Marrero, a podcast designed for you guys to listen about Jesus, topics about your daily lives, and how does that is implemented in our daily lives as Christians. Today with us, we had an amazing, I'm telling you, an amazing professor from Houston Baptist University. His name is Timothy Brookins. Hey, Timothy Brookins, how are you
How's it
doing,
going?
Professor?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Appreciate it.
yeah, yeah. You know, let people know more about you. So what do you do for a living? Talk
Yeah,
to us.
so I do teach at Houston Baptist University with our own Luis Marrero, the illustrious. I came to HBU in 2011.
Wow.
Was hired on as Latin faculty, but have since transitioned into the Department of Classics and Biblical Languages. So that encompasses our Latin and Greek and Hebrew languages, and also classical backgrounds to the New Testament period. So looking into what Judaism was like around that time, what we call Second Temple Judaism,
Yes, sir.
and exploring the Greco-Roman culture, and how understanding that culture helps us understand the world of the Bible and the Bible itself better.
Yeah, you guys, let me tell you something. He knows like a million languages. You know, those are you.
1,000.
Like,
Yeah.
so like if you want to learn about how to translate the Bible or from the original Greek, this is the guy from Latin, the guy from Hebrew, the guy, like every single language out there. I'm telling you, he's super smart. I took a class with him on I think it was the Bible in the Greek, the summer one on July. What was the name of that
Yeah.
one?
So classics and Christianity.
Classics and Christianity. So today we're gonna talk about that a little bit. So let's get into today's topic, and it's Paul and his letters. So talk to me. Who is Paul? Why are you interested in Paul and his letters?
Well, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
Paul, obviously an extremely important figure in
Right.
early Christianity, and today a controversial figure in terms
Right.
of what he seems to be saying in his letters. There's a lot of different ideas about the theology behind it. But that is my area of specialization, is the Apostle Paul, and I've worked primarily in First Corinthians,
Yeah.
and most recently in the Thessalonian letters. So I had written my dissertation at Baylor University was on the background of First Corinthians, looking at what was happening in the church that Paul was responding to, right? This church that was so divided, that was so obsessed with some kind of wisdom that Paul thought was at odds with the wisdom of the cross. And I sought to kind of reconstruct that situation. And my view was that the Corinthian Christians, perhaps some who were a little bit more well-to-do, who may have had some form of philosophical education, had kind of understood Paul's message in terms of Stoic philosophy, and had created an adapted form of Stoic philosophy that brought together kind of Paul's message and Stoicism itself. And that when they did this, these folks who had studied in this way, who believed that they possessed the Spirit, which gave them a special knowledge, that they were somehow better than other believers who were not yet aware of the knowledge that they had and the implications that it had for their lives. And so they had created this kind of two-tier view of Christians, right? There's the knowledgeable ones, and then there's the foolish ones, or the wise ones and the foolish ones, or the mature ones and the immature ones. And you see all these kinds of dichotomies in the letter. And to my mind, that's what was behind it. And obviously that created division and dissension between those different groups in the church.
Well, let me ask you this, because almost every Christian knows that the New Testament, most of the New Testament was written by Paul, right? So they are like, well, he has to be an important figure. And then if the Christians of the first century or whatever, they were like, oh, let's put all these books together, and they were like, well, Paul, there's like everything that is from Paul is there, right? Or at least that we know
the
of,
things
right?
that were preserved,
Right,
and
yeah.
obviously considered very important things that he had written.
Yeah. So, and then you have all this, even me, when I was doing my bachelor degree, I was like, so if Paul has many letters, why, and why is he so important, right? Because you got the Gospels, and you only got 4 books, right? Just saying the same message, right?
Mhm.
But then you got Paul, right? And he's like writing a bunch of letters to everyone. And when I was younger, I was like, well, he just like writing letters. Hey, you're doing this wrong, and like here as a letter, just. But talk to me specifically. What are the letters that we're gonna touch today about?
Okay, right. So even to back it up a little further,
Right.
the point that you made about Paul just being an extremely important figure. If you think about the ministry of Jesus and the stories told about him in the Gospels, this is all happening in Galilee and Judea, just a
Yeah.
very small territory in the ancient Near East. And it's not until later that disciples of Jesus go out into what in that day was part of the Roman Empire, all over the Roman provinces, spreading the good news. And so what was in a very true sense the climax to the story of Israel, right?
Right.
That Israel is God's people, and that they had disobeyed, but that God was faithful to redeem them and had done so in the person of the Messiah. God's intention was that the Gentiles would be included among God's people as well. And Paul, when he was converted, was struck by a very powerful sense that he was called to bring that message to the world. And so it's Paul, of course, the Great Commission, and Jesus sends out all the disciples, but it's Paul in particular who sets himself to the task of establishing specifically Gentile churches.
Let me ask you this, because this goes right to that topic. So why? I think Paul was a key instrument, right, for spreading the gospel. But why is that? Because is it because he knew Greek and he knew Hebrew, or like why he just went to these countries? Talk to me more about like his ministry, like where he went and where he comes from, and kind of his background a little bit.
Yeah, excellent question. So, as an apostle of the Gentiles, I mean, he wants to reach as many Gentiles as possible.
Right.
But strategically, how do you reach as many as possible? So one is you target people that speak the language that the most people speak.
Right.
So at that time, around the Mediterranean world, right, as far west as Spain and Italy and in Greece and Macedonia and in Asia, which is modern day Turkey, the common language was Greek. And so he targeted Greek-speaking areas. But he also targeted specifically large cities. Again, this is a strategic decision to hit as many people as possible, and to hit those people that were best connected with other places around the empire. And so he moves westward into this predominantly Gentile territory, hitting the big cities, trying to establish connections, maybe targeting upper class people to some degree, maybe not because they're better than anybody else, but because that gives meeting places for Christians to meet, those with larger homes that could accommodate churches, and then those who were connected well socially across the city. And so the very first letter that we have that was written to a church founded by Paul was the letter of First Thessalonians. So even though it doesn't come first in the order of the books, the Pauline letters, we think that chronologically it was the earliest of those letters to be written.
Wow.
And so this is normally dated to about the year 50 AD, so about 20 years after the death of Christ.
Wow.
Paul had founded a church in Thessalonica in the ancient province of Macedonia. So today it would be considered part of Macedonia, or Greek-speaking Macedonia. And he had founded a church that consisted, like his other churches, primarily, and some people think exclusively, of Gentiles. Because in the first chapter of First Thessalonians, he says, you turned to God from idols, right, to worship the living and true God. And that kind of generalization about the church tells us these people they were not part of Judaism. Did not consider themselves Jews or worshipers of the one God, but they had in the past been worshipers of not the Father of Jesus, right? Other God or gods. And they've now come to be believers in Christ. And this is such a radical conversion for them, because the life of the city is really religious life. Right? There was no separation between religion and politics or religion and city affairs. I mean, public occasions would have been religious occasions,
Right.
and the temples and the priests that staffed those temples, those were often public positions, right?
Right.
And so here these guys are with very little training in the scriptures, and what we would call the Old Testament scriptures. Paul had been there for perhaps as few or as short a time as a few weeks, and he leaves them abruptly, which we could talk about a little more. And this important background information behind First Thessalonians is his departure, but that after just a few weeks of instruction and probably very little schooling in the Jewish scriptures, these guys who had just recently been pagans are now Christ believers and are having to reorient their entire lives around it in a context where there are almost no other believers and everybody else is engaged in the religious life of the city.
Yeah, no, it's just so crazy, right? Because you see the apostles, right, during this period of time, and they're dropping like flies, right? They're just killing them left and right, right? And then you got this guy who comes, Paul, right? And he comes from Tarsus, right?
That's right.
Oh, you see, I learned that from his class, ladies and gentlemen. So, and then this guy from Tarsus, he speaks Greek, he speaks Hebrew, right? And his education was Greek education, right? I think.
So another kind of controversial question about Paul, because he doesn't tell us how he was educated, as a child. In the book of Acts, he says that he was born in Tarsus, but he says that he was reared and educated in this city, referring to Jerusalem.
Oh,
and so it's hard to tell when he says this, how long was he reared in Jerusalem versus how long had he been educated in Tarsus prior to that. And so it's quite possible he'd been educated in Tarsus up through his teenage years.
Right.
And eventually he was trained as a Pharisee, which he tells us was the most rigorous rabbinic education you could get. These guys were experts in the law of Moses, and they were experts in the interpretation of the law of Moses that had been passed down orally by the rabbis. So a highly educated guy, as you said, from Tarsus, which was in the province of Cilicia in the area called Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And so having been born there, he also tells us he was born a Roman citizen.
Right.
Whether he knew Latin or not, we don't know.
Yeah.
But Greek was probably his primary language, but there's a very high likelihood that he also knew Hebrew. And so he was in the perfect position to be a missionary to the world because he understood the Jewish scriptures as well as anybody. And he was a Greek-speaking person who had been educated, or at least was very at home in the world of Greek and Roman culture, in a way that made him an effective communicator with people that grew up in this environment.
So let me ask you this, because I think this was also a unique time in place in history that we kind of don't see it as much because it's like the birth of Christianity, right? And then like people, all these disciples are spreading, and they're people are getting converted left and right to Christianity, and all this, like you said, like just recent new Christians, and so they have all this background of the previous religion and their education, because Rome was like, we're not only going to conquer you, but we're gonna this is what you talk now, this is what you read, this is like yeah. So he goes to these areas and there's like, okay, is he teaching them how to be a church? Is he teaching them how to be a Christian in a church? What is he teaching them? Because they're fairly new, right?
Yes, such great questions. And so much of it is a mystery because when he's writing these letters, they know what's happening.
Right.
Right. And so that kind of information can be left out. And unfortunately, that means we don't hear it clearly. But we have some pretty good guesses about what he was doing. I mean, the amount of times that he quotes from the Jewish scriptures in his letters, especially Romans, But in most of his letters, he's explicitly quoting from the Jewish scriptures. And if these are predominantly Gentile churches, they wouldn't have known this stuff
Right.
until they were taught. And so
Yeah.
either they were people that were kind of hangers-on at the synagogue, what they called God-fearers, who were sympathetic to Judaism and kind of liked its teachings, but hadn't gone all the way, which would have meant circumcising.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just didn't want to.
You don't want to do that.
Yeah, I like everything else. I don't like that part.
Yeah.
Right?
So then Thessalonians. Why is those letters, first and second, important?
Yeah. So first, as I mentioned, it's of all the letters we have in the New Testament, it's the earliest of those that were written, around the year 50. And so it gives us a window into Paul's ministry in the earliest period that we have evidence for. And it reads differently than most of the other letters. So whereas some of the other ones, especially Romans, almost read like a doctrinal treatise, right? They don't read like a letter, right? Because you don't write like a 30-page letter to people that,
right.
that, that give the ins and outs of, doctrine.
Yeah.
Even though Romans is a letter, it was actually sent to a church in Rome. First Thessalonians is different, First and Second Thessalonians, in their very personal quality, right? So even though there's theology in it, what he's doing is it's one person writing to people that he knew well, who are dealing with a very specific situation that he's trying to speak into. And so one thing we haven't talked about yet is within the various religious options in the Roman world, weren't just these Greek cults to, traditional Olympian gods, but there was developing an emperor cult. And so over time, there would eventually be certain emperors that said, I am God. I demand to be viewed as a god.
Right.
But in Paul's day, the emperors weren't really doing that yet. And, some had taken steps in that direction. But in the provinces, right, these are Greek-speaking people primarily who have been subjugated by Rome. What they want to do is they want to curry Rome's favor. They want to say, we support you, Rome. We are loyal. We stand for the, everything that Rome stands for, and kind of the symbolic greatness of Rome is something that we are fully behind. And so one thing that happened in the provinces was that they voluntarily established these temples and these priesthoods dedicated to the worship of the emperor. And so they were extremely important in order to show how loyal you were. And because all city life was religious and all religious life was political, you really couldn't escape participation in it at some level. And so if you showed that in any way you were not supportive of the emperor or the emperor cult or the divine greatness of Rome, then you could be perceived as somebody who's a dissident, a revolutionist, or at least very weird in a way that makes me suspicious that you might be up to something, right? And so this is very likely something that the Thessalonian church was dealing with. So let's back up to the book of Acts, which tells us about Paul's founding visit to Thessalonica in Acts 17. So he spends some time in the synagogue speaking about, proving Jesus the Messiah from the scriptures, and we hear that some Jews were converted. But it says that a great number of God-fearers and leading women. And so those other two groups seem to make up the majority of his converts. What happens is that there are Jews in town that become jealous. It says they became jealous of Paul. His missionary success, maybe he was stealing people away from the synagogue. And they go into the marketplace and they recruit some ruffians to come in to find Paul and just like
smack him
around a little bit. You better stop this. But they don't find him. And meanwhile, he flees the city, and they go to the house of Jason, who was apparently giving Paul hospitality while I was there. And they drag Jason before the governor. And they say, these guys are turning the world upside down. And so they say, well, Jason, if you just give us a little bit of money, we'll let you go. But this background's all very important to First Thessalonians, because these new converts are very abruptly separated from the guy that founded this movement, and that has, disembedded them from this, common religious life that people lived there.
Right. Right.
and he's left them, orphaned. And what will they do? And he's worried meantime because he's had to leave quickly and secretly. He doesn't know the situation. What's happened to them since he left? Do they come through this okay? Has their faith been shaken? Will they fall away? And so he writes First Thessalonians just as Timothy has returned, who he had sent to Thessalonica to check on them. He says he himself wasn't able to go because Satan had hindered him.
Wow.
We don't know what that means. Does that mean that the governor had issued some kind of sanction on his return? You can't return.
Come back, yeah.
And this is one thing that early Christians do is they align often the powers that be that stand against Christians. They align those with Satan, and so that could be what he meant. He wasn't able to return, so he sends Timothy. Timothy comes back and says, "Paul, great news. Their faith is strong." And Paul says, "This is great news. I'm relieved. I'm completely relieved." Doesn't say anything about whether they were still experiencing persecution. And actually, he drops some hints through the letter that suggests they might even still be persecuted.
Yeah.
But he's relieved because their faith is strong.
Yeah, because like I've never gone to a church, and then ask you about it a couple of weeks. Oh yeah, their faith's still strong. No, that sounds like they were going through, hell and back. I guess, like it's.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you test faith, right? Like,
it's so they probably lost friends, family members that were close to them. As Christ says, he came to bring division, right? Mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and allegiance to Christ often is mutually exclusive from allegiance to any other Lord, any other religion, any other God.
So every time we like when I read these books, it reminded me of the Aeneid, the Iliad, and how they trace this religious storyline, and then they mix it with the government, or like the government. It's like the same thing in a way. It's kind of like the Old Testament too. You got like the Israel as a religious and at the same time government, mixed. And do you think that the Israelites were persecuted during that period of time because their religion has some no-nos that the Greeks were expecting them to do?
So the Jews specifically, rather than Paul's converts?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, because if you became a Christian, right, then there's going to be a bunch of no-nos for those Christians in not participating in somewhat of the culture that the Greeks were expecting them to do, right? Yeah. So they were like, I guess, exposing themselves by not doing these things? Like, how does that work?
So the Christian movement at first was in this really ambiguous position, right? Because it was still attached to Judaism for really decades. I mean, the parting of the ways between Christians and Jews, or Christianity and Judaism, it took decades, generations, and even centuries in a way for that divorce to be complete. And so from the perspective of the public, from the perspective of the government, this early Christian movement was internal to Judaism, right? Something that was happening within Judaism. And so this put both Christians and Jews in a very odd predicament. So the Jews themselves were given all kinds of special privileges by the Roman government, exemptions, the Roman government. They were allowed to worship their own God, and nobody was going to force them to worship any other. Okay. Occasionally that would happen. But it was always a mistake, right? The Jews didn't like it when you tried to make them worship somebody other than their God. They were allowed to give tax to their own temple, and Rome wasn't allowed to take it. I mean, there were certain things that they were allowed to do, and Rome respected Judaism because Judaism was so old. That was really important. The antiquity of your religion, your philosophy, if you could trace that way, way back, they'd say, well, I respect that.
Right.
And so you guys can just keep doing your thing. You've been around a long time doing your thing. Right. So when this early Christian movement happens, and there's this internal controversy, Jews that don't like Paul's message because you seem to be saying that Jesus is divine, and how does that really work with monotheism? Right. And wasn't Jesus crucified on a cross? That means he was cursed. And don't you have to obey the law of Moses to be one of God's people? And you seem to be saying these Gentiles don't have to obey the law of Moses. So these zealous Jews, it wasn't all Jews, but especially the more zealous, like Paul had been, saying, look, it's extremely important that everybody be obeying the law. And just like Phineas in the Old Testament, who took matters into his own hand, and the Israelites who had slept with the Moabite prostitutes, he slayed all of them, and slayed the women, and he was praised for it. And through Jewish history, in certain places in the Old Testament, through the book of First Maccabees, is one that a lot of people don't know, but tells the story of Judaism around about 150 BC. That there was this stream of thought that, yes, we can take violent action and ought to take violent action against lawbreakers, breakers of the law of Moses.
Right.
And so as all of this is happening, as Paul ministers, you have these conflicts that begin to draw attention within the city, that draws the eye of Rome. And the Jews didn't want to be associated with these Christians, but at the same time, this Christian movement was considered by most people to be something that was happening within Judaism. And so it was a hard place for Jews to be in. It was a hard place for Christians to be in, especially once it became evident that they were doing something different and saying something different than most other Jews were saying. And it was a tough place for Rome to be in a sense, from an administrative standpoint, because they had to somehow discriminate, who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, and so who should have these special privileges and who should not have these privileges. And if they're fighting, does it even really matter if we give them special privileges? We just need to make sure these things don't happen. These quarrels don't break out in our cities.
Yeah, and the church stage was so early. It's not like us right now that you become part of a church, you remember, and probably your name is written somewhere. Back then it was like, oh, I'm a Jew, and then you walk 3 blocks and it's like, oh no, I'm Christian. Like nobody knows, right? It's just like probably that's why one of the confusions, right? It's like, well, they were Jews, now they're Christians, or like, is Christians part of Judaism, right? Mm-hmm. Like what was happening.
Yeah.
Right?
And Paul's argument is, yes, these guys are a part of Judaism, right? It's because they're attached to, believers are attached to Christ. They're in Christ, united with Christ. And Christ, of course, is the embodiment of Israel. And so eventually Paul will articulate this in a pretty clear fashion in Romans. He says, Gentiles are grafted onto the tree of Israel. This is all, the whole church movement is happening within Judaism. But then from the perspective of a lot of other Jews saying, no, this isn't even Judaism. It's something different. And so it just depended on who you asked.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So during that early Christianity, their church, right, they gathered, and I mean, I think they were thinking more Hellenistic in a way, right? They had like this previous baggage, right? And preconceived like conceptions and like ideas and like how things work. Did Paul? Do you think that Paul tackles some of that in his letters? Like, what's he doing there?
Right. So if you have a church that consists in primarily Greek-speaking people with no background in the Jewish faith, what religious ideas would they have known? What philosophical ideas would they have known? They would have been more familiar with Greek and Roman cultural ideas.
Right.
Now, something that a lot of people don't think about is the education level of these church members. Most people weren't literate, and so we don't know if Paul's churches had a large percentage of literate people and people that were higher up on the social scale. A lot of people think, and I think this is right, that there's a guy named Erastus that Paul mentions in Romans 16 is called the treasurer of the city. And we think that the treasurer there, that's the Greek word is used for the Latin public office of aedile, which would have been one of the highest public offices in a Roman city. Wow. And so this Erastus may have been almost right at the top of the social scale, but how many folks were like that, right? And so if you weren't literate, the ideas that you had absorbed about, Greek and Roman culture would have just been absorbed from what's happening around you. The ordinary practices of ordinary people. If you were part of like a club, A lot of people were members of clubs. So if you were a silversmith, you'd be a member of a silversmith club. So the kind of things my silversmith buddies are doing, I guess that's, that's
That's way.
kind of the way I think too.
Yeah.
You haven't necessarily read it in a book, but
Right.
and so with Paul, he might not have the Iliad in his hand being like, oh, I'm going to use this idea from the Iliad because they'll know that.
Right.
They might or might not. They probably wouldn't know it from reading it because probably wouldn't have read it.
Yeah.
But the Iliad and the Odyssey, these epics of Homer were so influential in that culture that a lot of people knew the stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey just from common currency, from stories that were told, from little sayings that they might have derived from it. And so that's kind of the level at which Paul is reaching these people, is not exactly out of books, but here's kind of the way that people talk. Here's some of the ideas that are just kind of passed around and the assumptions that are just absorbed because you live in that world. And you get that without reading it in books, without being educated about it.
Yeah, I think it's just the way I see it. I might be wrong. You can clarify me on that. But the way I see it is like, even like us, right? We're born, let's say you're born here in the States, and then you have your history is like, oh, World War I, World War II, and like North and the South, right? Even if you don't know how to read or write, but that's like part of like your culture as you grow up. So I think that the Romans with, the story of Romulus and Remus, right? And how did Rome, was built, and, so I think that somewhat they were like, well, if I'm a Roman citizen, I need to know how Rome probably, the story behind it, because in order for you to have a king or a ruler, you had to say why he's the guy, right? If he was special or not, right? And then that's where the this Greek books like the Aeneid and the Iliad, there's like, well, they're selected by God, or they're demigods, or they're like God in a physical kind of form, and then how. So I think that in some kind of way they did had all that baggage culturally wise. So whenever they come to Christianity, right, they're like, oh, you're sitting down here, and it's like, well, none of that is true. It's like, this is all a political agenda, or it's like, how do you spread that message and not get killed or persecuted, right?
Right. So from Rome's perspective, they say, well, we dominate the world. Well, we need to be able to justify that and legitimate that. Do we have a right to rule the world? And so you would make the case by propaganda. You'd say propaganda is just something that's put out by the government to help legitimate its own power. Right. And so one of the ways this happened was through Roman literature. And there was a founding epic written by Virgil that was endorsed by those who were part of the circle of the emperor. Said, we really need a founding story, a story that tells about how Rome came to be, when it was founded, and the fact that it was fated to become the greatest empire that's ever existed. Right. And so Virgil wrote a story that we call the Aeneid that tells the story of how Aeneas had taken some of his people from Troy when Troy was burning to the ground. Right. And he had gone on and he had landed in Italy, and eventually his descendants founded the city of Rome. And so the Aeneid says all throughout, like, this was supposed to happen. Right. The gods wanted this to happen. Aeneas was supposed to do this. And the greatness of Rome, the power of Rome, that was all supposed to happen. And so if you want to argue with us, you just need to remember that this is the way that God's wanted. This is God's will. And so that's a form of propaganda. So when Virgil, the poet who wrote this, is writing it, I mean, is he thinking, I'm just going to write a total lie and hope that everybody believes it? I mean, he might know it's like, I don't really fully buy into this story, but this is kind of the rhetoric of the empire, right? This is kind of the way we talk, and this is the way we prefer to think about things, right? Because we prefer to think that, the gods want it this way. And really, we just like being powerful. And so if we just kind of create a backstory there that justifies it, and great. Yeah. And then Virgil was also just a poet and probably liked writing great literature. And that was probably just the enjoyment of writing it was probably a part of it too. Yeah. All of that to say, though, is this is the kind of ideology, right? Right. That Rome is great and Rome is supposed to have power. that if you didn't accept that and endorse it and get behind it, then you were in danger of looking like, you could even be a revolutionary. I mean, maybe not quite that bad, but we want people that really support us.
Right.
And so everybody would have been familiar with that. I mean, if you lived in one of the Roman provinces, especially a city like Thessalonica, which is a bigger city than most, they would have all been, part of this concern that, yeah, Rome is watching us. We want to look good, and so you guys just better get on board and with everybody else.
Yeah, and I just find it quite amazing because you have, like you said, all this Roman storyline where like we're meant to be here because God called us to be here, even though the writer was probably like, he had the Caesar breathing in his neck to make sure that everything that he wrote was particularly,
Yeah, and we don't know exactly. I mean, but we suspect that Virgil couldn't say anything just like directly bad about the emperor. Probably,
right?
That would have been dangerous.
I mean, look at the story of all the emperors back then. You said something, and the next day you were, with a guillotine over your neck, or like it was nothing good for you, right? So I don't know. I think it's safe to assume that. What I think is safe to assume that if you were against Roman, that they were supposed to be there, I think they would, make sure that you didn't see the next day or something like that.
Yeah, it could come to that, right? I mean, so, but empire-wide kind of systematic, state-sanctioned persecution of Christians wasn't happening quite yet, but you definitely had local conflicts that could have led to to lynchings. I mean, Paul is stoned how many times? I mean, he tells us that in his letters.
Yeah.
And so these things are happening, and it would have been easy probably in a lot of cases to look the other way, right? And so clearly at least the apostles, these missionaries were being violently persecuted in cases.
I mean, yeah, you have a bunch of apostles getting stoned to death, and it wasn't 2020. I'll tell you that much. So for you, what do you think that the Thessalonians? What is the message of the Thessalonians for us today? What do you think that is?
Yeah, so if you take the letter of First Thessalonians, say, in the window that it gives us into these people's lives, is there was a lot at stake by being a Christian. You were risking a lot. You were risking your family, your friends, which, by the way, could also jeopardize your business, right?
Right.
People say, you can't be a part of our club anymore because this club is dedicated to this God, and so you're out. And now if you're not a part of the silversmiths club, you don't get any business, and so you suffer economically. And so there was a lot at stake. And you see just how, for them, converting was a true conversion. I mean, a complete, like, taking you out of the life that you had and the assumptions you had and putting you down into a completely different life. Your connections are different. The way you think is different. The way you want to live is different. Your loyalties are different. And Paul wanted to make sure that they held on to that because he knew how difficult it would be to stick to it in those situations. And so, thinking from the perspective of a modern North American,
right?
I haven't spent a lot of time in developing world areas where persecution is real, or other places in the globe where violent persecution is real. But we don't really think about that for the most part here. Yeah. And it was the same for the Thessalonians. I mean, you had to really want to do this,
right?
To be part of it. And so it's a test to you. Once you start looking at the situation that way, saying, "Wow, I mean, would I be willing to make that step, right?" Which would be, for us, you grow up in America, and every city's got churches, and every corner's got multiple churches, and if my friends don't go to a church, they're at least okay with me going to church, right? And it's just
right.
all a part. We just take totally for granted that that we can be a part of that.
Yeah.
And for them, there was a lot more at stake.
Yeah, they were like, I can be a Christian tomorrow and then get persecuted and get
Yeah,
killed that same day or the next day, or
yeah.
probably you have to meet in secrecy, or like caves or whatever. We
Hmm.
just do it here, in the open. So that's quite interesting. That's just from that early on. I think though it applies to us too, even though we don't have it as harsh as them. There's a lot of things that take out our time with like God, dedication, and it takes, like, we watch TV and it's like, oh, I didn't pray today. Whoops. It's like, well, maybe we're not getting uh persecuted by a state or a country or whatever, but we are in a way pushed towards a less Christian society in a way,
Hmm.
and we are called to stay strong and
Yeah.
yeah, which is very interesting. The Paul was already tackling that early, in a
Right.
way.
I mean, you mentioned, praying. I'm watching TV instead of praying, but
Yeah.
there's not that sense of urgency
Right.
that the Thessalonians had. And so at the end of the letter where he says, rejoice always,
Yeah.
pray at all times and everything give thanks. Think about that from their perspective now. Rejoice, why?
What?
Pray always. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot happening here. And everything give thanks. I don't know what I have to give thanks for, but obviously the message is, you have something greater than your physical well-being.
Right.
And that's the hope of Jesus Christ, who is now the Lord of all things and has begun the process of restoring humanity and all of creation, and then finally we will experience resurrection and the climax to our redemption. And so rejoice because of that, give thanks because of that, and pray now that I don't fall away because of my circumstances are so difficult.
Right. So, talk to me about Second Thessalonians. Why is it important?
Yeah, Second Thessalonians was likely written just weeks, a couple months, maybe 2 or 3 months after First Thessalonians.
Okay.
So the situation seems to be pretty similar. It looks like the church is still experiencing persecution.
Right.
It looks like they still have questions about eschatology, so questions surrounding the end times, what's going to happen at the end, when is Christ going to return. And then there's also this problem with a group of people that in Greek are called the ataktoi, the disorderly. Yeah, and we're not exactly sure what was meant by disorderly, but in Second Thessalonians, this group, it said that they're not working. And so all three of these issues, though, seem to be continuous with what's happening in First Thessalonians, is why we think it's written so shortly after. But one of the things that Second Thessalonians is best known for is this discussion of the man of lawlessness in chapter 2. And so Paul says, with respect to the resurrection and the gathering in to Christ, and then he goes into this discussion about the end. He says, look, I told you when I was there that first the man of lawlessness has to come.
Right.
And before that, you have the one who opposes and the one who elevates himself above all things called God and even sits in the temple of God. This is the man of lawlessness. And who is the man of lawlessness, right? Are we to look for a specific individual? Is Paul referring to some guy that's going to come along?
Yeah, just some random guy
sometime in
walking
the
around
future. Yeah,
in flip flops or
and
something.
so who knows? But Paul's point there was not really, hey, look out for the man of lawlessness. His point was, don't worry, the end has not come yet,
Right.
and you should know that because these signs are going to precede the end. So just remember, these things haven't happened yet. The man of lawlessness hasn't come yet. And so just everybody calm down a little bit because the end is not yet. Yeah.
So, regarding eschatology, you think they wanted to know what was going on because, they were kind of being persecuted a little bit, or a lot, and during that period, they were like,
Yeah.
well, what happens if I die, right? Where do I go, kind of deal? Or do you think it was more like, well, when is Rome going to be destroyed so we can be free? Do you think that those questions were the driven force from the Thessalonians
Yeah, it was a great question, and all of those things could have an element of truth in them. One thing that's different in Second Thessalonians and
Mm.
First is in First Thessalonians, he says, "I don't want you to be ignorant about those who have fallen asleep." Right, and he
Right.
goes into the whole thing that those who are already dead will experience the resurrection. And
Right.
some seem to think, well, the people that died won't get to see Christ when he returns.
Mm.
The people who are alive will get to see Christ when he returns. And Paul says, well, no, actually, those who are dead now will be raised first, and then we will be raised. And so we'll all get to experience the return of Christ. And so in Second Thessalonians, the situation seems to be different.
Mm.
There, some people seem to think that the day of the Lord has already come. It's already happened. So we're not wondering about who will experience it when it happens.
Right.
We're thinking that it's already happened.
Mm.
At least the first part of it, the day of the Lord and the judgment. So maybe Christ hasn't returned, but we're kind of there now
Yeah.
because the day of the Lord is already happening. And so they could have been interpreting their persecution as the kind of tribulations that come in this period of final judgment.
Hmm. So let me ask you this. When a pastor is gonna preach and just teach about this two letters, what would you think will be the key elements that they should look into, whenever they're gonna teach it to the church, just how the pastoral work behind those letters?
Yeah, so the obvious text would be First Thessalonians 4 about the hope of the resurrection and the
Mm.
return of Christ,
Mm.
especially as consolation for those who are grieving.
Right.
Right, and so it's a common passage read at funerals is that, look, we have the hope of the resurrection.
Right.
We can be sure of that, and so we shouldn't grieve. Which actually, if I think that Paul is saying there, Christians shouldn't grieve, and that's extreme, and I think he's exaggerating a little bit too. But he
Right.
is saying that there's this clear difference between us who believe in a resurrection and
Mhm.
others who don't believe in a resurrection,
Mm.
and that difference is so radical that like those people have reason to grieve because they won't have the resurrection. But we will have the resurrection, and so we shouldn't
Right.
grieve. And so he kind of puts it in those stark terms, even though I think he would have allowed us to cry, right, for the
Right.
loss
Right.
of our people. But what First Thessalonians shows, I think, is really valuable, but that is really ignored usually in the reading of the letter, is the kind of relationship it reveals between a founder of a church and the
Mm.
people in the church.
Mm.
And that's, in a way, that's the whole letter is, look,
Yeah.
I was separated from you guys quickly. I had to leave secretly, but don't think that I don't love you.
Right.
I
Right.
care about you a whole lot. And so from the beginning of the letter to the end, he's just encouraging them. He's saying, you guys are awesome. You turned to Jesus Christ, and I've seen the powerful transformation in your lives. And Timothy told me himself that you guys are loving one another, that your faith is strong. And it's all just this encouragement. And he uses all of these techniques that a lot of the ancient philosophers used, because the schools of philosophy, they were like schools, right? You had
Right. Right.
the teacher, the either the founder of the philosophy or the next successor of the founder of the philosophy.
Mm.
He was a master, and he had a system that he tried to impart to you. It wasn't
Right.
just a system of doctrines; it was a way of living.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it was so important that the transformation of that new way of living happened, that they had these little psychagogic techniques,
Okay.
which means like a way of leading the soul.
Right. Right.
So it was this recognition that, okay, even though you converted, we can't just expect instantaneous and total transformation and you never lapse again.
Mm.
The philosophers said, look, I know that this new transformation, this new way of life is difficult. It's hard to put these doctrines into practice.
Mm.
I'm here to encourage you. You guys encourage one another. Or they'll treat the new convert as a baby and kind of slowly increase the expectations.
Wow.
So they don't overburden them at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so all of these little tricks that we see the philosophers using, we see Paul using a lot of those same things, that reflects a very great sensitivity to the different levels of faith of the people in the church. And he tries to speak to each one at just the right level, nurturing them in just the right way.
Yeah.
At each point. And so that kind of adaptation to where your people are, I think, is really valuable part of that letter.
Yeah, and I think, that is something that we had to retake because you have 1950s, 1960s, people with pamphlets walking around. You're going to hell.
Yeah.
Convert, or like a fork and
Mm-hmm.
and so we lost this nurturing portion to how to spread the message. That is a strong message. That is a message that can get you killed, right? It's very polemical message,
Mm-hmm.
but you know when the people are at church, we're like, even when the people come to church and they come to Christ, then we expect them to be like, hey, now where's this button-up shirt, and
Mm-hmm.
long jeans, and like now all the things that you did in the past, you can't,
Yeah.
they it's like a change from today, from the same day, right? Instead of working those people towards, their relationship with God, and like if I have a problem with lying, it's a problem that needs to be addressed slowly. and
Mm-hmm.
and I think, like you said, it's very, very interesting that you use like the words of like nurturing and like looking at their level and working with them in those level in particular, and saying that I was taken away from you. It was more like a circumstance, and it's giving you like, oh, we're a family, we're just one group. Unity is one of the key things, I guess he was, feeling at the point of time. So that's I think that's one of the that's just an amazing thing for the pastors, and whoever is preaching basically
Mm-hmm.
to know. Now, I'm gonna ask you one more question, and it's for what does these letters have? What the importance of these letters for me personally, for my daily life, for my devotional with God? Like, what is Paul trying to tell me as a person?
Yeah. So another um, theme in First Thessalonians, I think, is often overlooked, is this theme of what scholars call cruciformity, which is like cross-shaped life.
Mm,
And so, what was the life that Jesus lived? It was a life of humility, and a
mm,
life that said, I will sacrifice my own interests for other people. It was a life that says, I will submit to your reproaches, I will submit to your attacks.
mm.
Even though you're my enemy, I will love you and I will live humbly.
Wow.
And Paul himself aspired to be an imitator of that. So it wasn't like, well, Jesus is one thing and he saved me, but I'll never be like Jesus. It was his whole object was to
Yeah.
become like Jesus, because
Yeah.
those who are believers are in Christ. We're
Mm,
united with him. And so we share in all that he is. And so we're to become little Christ. And he says, imitate Christ as, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is in 1 Corinthians 11:1. But you see little pieces of that in 1 Thessalonians, his earliest letter that we're aware
wow.
of.
Yeah.
He presents himself as a model to imitate. It's just bold. It's really
Right.
bold. And you don't see pastors doing that very much, right? Be
Not
like
really.
me. Be like me. Um, but in a way, it sounds very arrogant. But I guess when you listen to what he's saying, be like me. That is humble and lowly, and somebody who makes other people more important than
Mm,
themselves. And so all of that's there in the letter too, especially in chapter 2. He's presenting himself as a model like that, and wishes for them to become the same. And so it's both something that pastors could implement, that kind of bold, like this is what I'm trying to be because this is what Christ is, and you all should
right.
want to be like that too.
Right.
But also just the imitation of Christ, the cruciform way is something that's taught in some ways subtly through that letter, but is really once you're tuned into that theme in Paul's letters, it's all over the place. I mean, it's the center of his theology is
Right.
being in Christ means to be like him,
Yeah.
and he was a kind of person that sacrificed his own interests for others. We ought to be the same.
Wow. That works for today, tomorrow, and a millennia from here. So, man, I would love to have you another time again. It just has so much knowledge, so such an amazing topic. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It was I keep learning all the time, so that's one of the the greatest things about Christianity. You guys, if you guys are interested, there are classes at Houston Baptist University. You go to hbu.edu and check them out. Dr. Brookins, he teaches a bunch of language classes. He teaches, what are the other classes that you teach?
Yeah, so the class on Second Temple Judaism,
Yeah.
so Judaism around the time of the New Testament.
Yeah.
The class on Classics in Christianity, which basically is the Greco-Roman world around the time of the New Testament.
Yeah. Second Temple Judaism?
Yeah, Second Temple. And then the one on second century Christianity, which is kind of a continuation of the history of the church from, the first missionaries through the book of Acts, and then what happens after. As the church begins to grow, becomes a more kind of institutionalized thing with 3 tiers of leaders, and at the top you've got your bishops, and we explore all of that as we move into the second century.
And if someone doesn't have the means to pay for a full bachelor, master's, or whatever program is there a way for them to sit down and listen to your class?
Yeah, so we have, there are a couple different options. One is we offer certificates. Wow. So rather than completing a degree, you can take, say, 4 classes in a particular area and then get a certificate. You can get a certificate in Greek, or a certificate in Latin, certificate in New Testament. And another option for graduate students especially is we have what are called surveyors, which is really like auditors. Yeah. So people that don't have to go through the application process or pay tuition, they just pay a small fee, and they get all the benefits of the class. Access to the professor, they get to sit in the classroom, they get his PowerPoint slides, all of that stuff, for something like $250 for a whole semester.
Wow, that's that's a lot cheaper than master class. So just take advantage of that, guys, because it's an amazing opportunity. What are you doing now? Are you writing? Are you just teaching? What are the things? If people want to know more about you, do you have a Facebook or an Instagram or like what's out there?
Yeah. So recently I finished 2 commentaries that will be in print within the next year.
Ooh.
One on 1 Corinthians in the Reading the New Testament series, published by Smith and Helwes. So look for that one. And a 1st and 2nd Thessalonians commentary I've just finished, and I'm going through the proofing phase. That'll probably be out in about a year. That's with Baker Publishing's Paideia series. So look out for both of those.
Wow.
And our programs at HBU, our department, the Department of Classics and Biblical Languages, we have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account where you can find us. Kind of see what's happening in the classroom, right? We post some videos, Luis drinking coffee, and
that's right,
and just things like that. So you can find it under HBU Classics and Biblical Languages, and we'd love to have you follow us.
Yeah, and then Instagram's Houston Theological Seminary, HTS. They are in Facebook, Instagram. The department has the apologetics department. Every department has their little Instagram or Facebook. So check them all out. There's a bunch of programs there. There is a full program on languages, right? Masters. What is
Masters in Biblical Languages. So you learn the 3 languages of the Bible: Hebrew, Aramaic, small portions written in Aramaic,
right,
and Greek. And so once you've completed those courses, you can read the whole Bible in the original language.
That is really cool. I can barely speak English. So. I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you very much for being here. Hey, you guys, just letting you know, we have, obviously this is going to be in YouTube, but if you're just a listener from podcast, it's going to be on Tuesdays and Thursday for listeners. And then Fridays are going to be me just by myself talking about Christian topics as usual. But you will have Dr. Brookins Tuesdays and Thursdays until all the little sections of 7 to 10 minutes are up. And thank you very much for listening. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube. What else we have? The other podcast is on Buzzsprout and Spotify. So like, share, and subscribe, guys. Thank you very much for listening, and see you guys in the next episode.